when it comes to ranked social systems, if you have read one of those old novels, one of the classics called Pride and Prejudice. Any of you remember that? Any of you ever read that book, Pride and Prejudice? Really? What do you people read? Angela Mayu or something? Oh, that's okay too, but you know, the old classics really dealt with this problem of ranked societies. And Pride and Prejudice is a study of rank in early English culture. The high-ranking gentlemen and the low-ranking poor common people, and you have this this conflict of can a poor girl marry well, and it makes for a great story if you like stories. Now I must admit that when I was in high school, I never read Pride and Prejudice. I was too much of a man to read Pride and Prejudice. You know, I read manly stories, you know, like Conan the Barbarian and. Well, not really, because Conan hadn't even been invented in my high school days. But, you know, I always read what I thought were more masculine books. And it took me a long time to get around to reading some of the great novels that are part of the English literature, and it was a fresh discovery as an adult to go back and read some of these classics. Anne of Green Gables, Little Women. Oh, I couldn't even think about reading Little Women when I was in high school. It was too much of a threat to my manhood, whatever that was, as a teenager. But in any case, you will find these, I think, exciting stories. And I must admit, I discovered all of this literature while I was a missionary living overseas. No television, no radio, nothing to entertain us. And I was desperate to read anything that was good. And so I got to read a lot of books, and was introduced to a whole range of Russian authors, English authors, American authors, and the like. Well, okay, rank. I grew up in America. We abolished rank. We did not want to have a rank. We did not want to have a noble class. We did not want to have commoners and peasants. We all wanted to be judged on the basis of who we were and what we could accomplish personally. So we dropped the whole Lord this or Lord that. We dropped the whole Sir this or Sir that. I went back through my ancestry, and I discovered that a number of Haywards had immigrated to Canada back in the 18th century. And I discovered, to my amazement, that some of them arrived, and when they put down profession, they simply wrote gentleman. They weren't carpenters, they weren't weavers, they were gentlemen. Usually these were people of higher ranking nobility who did not have a profession, who lived off of inherited wealth from their ancestors. They weren't any relatives of mine, unfortunately. My great-great-grandfather came to Canada as a miller and set up a flour mill on a small stream and made his livelihood grinding flour or grinding wheat into flour. In any case, rank was part of the whole European system. In America, we established a new way of looking at people in cultures, and actually it became a variation of what we call stratified social systems in anthropology. Now, there are two kinds of stratified societies. One is what we call caste. Caste is what you find in India, but also in other countries. But India is probably the most highly organized caste system in the world. Then you have class-based societies. Class-based societies is what we find in America. Now, one of the interesting things is, how did the early founders of the United States as a social system, how did they come across a class-based concept? And there are a number of people who are scholars of the ideology of the era of the Founding Fathers who claim that the class idea for class societies actually comes from Native American tribes. I'll let the historians and others figure that out. But in point of fact, it is a relatively new concept. It is a new experiment to try to develop a whole new culture around a class-oriented society. We'll talk about it in more detail yet today. Let's talk first about caste, because this is one of the stratified categories. In a caste-based society, your caste status is determined at birth. You cannot choose it, you cannot earn it, you are born into it. If your mother and your father are part of the untouchable class or caste, you are untouchable no matter what you do. You can win the lotto, you can become a TV movie star, you are still untouchable. You may not change that, nor may you change the future of your children. There is no mobility up or down. Money will not do it, marriage will not do it, education will not do it. And you may not marry outside of your caste. If somebody from one caste tries to marry somebody from another caste, the chances are very high that both the man and the woman will be killed in an honor killing. You cannot marry someone outside of your caste. And when it comes to caste, rewards are very caste specific. Wealth, including occupation, is set by your caste. People who are business people, the most likely people in business in India, in a caste society, are people who are from a business caste. They are the ones who can move into there quite legitimately. Now, what happens when someone who is not in the business class tries to move up into the business class? They will undoubtedly face opposition. Now, there are a number of movies about this where development agencies have gone overseas and tried to take untouchables, buy them a bicycle, get them into doing a bicycle pedicab business, only to find that members of the business caste will persecute their children, burn their houses, or even kill the individual involved. You may not move into an occupation that is not specific to your caste. There are a couple of things that are good about it. First of all, it guarantees you employment. It becomes almost like a guild. If you are in a leather worker's caste, you have a guaranteed future in leather work. Nobody's going to be able to take that job from you because only your caste can do that work. So it guarantees certain places in the society. This, by the way, is one of the reasons why people fight for caste. Even though it sounds unfair to us, for them, they love it because it gives certain guarantees and protection. When it comes to power, you have no contact between caste. An untouchable cannot touch somebody of a higher caste. So you have no contact. If you have people who are working in your kitchen, they must stay in the kitchen. They cannot move into other parts of the house. They cannot sit on your furniture. They cannot have any dealings with you. And if you feel violated by them, you can actually beat them or send them to prison. So there's this very controlling environment between those who have power and those who do not. And when it comes to prestige, prestige is enforced by laws of purity. Caste is all about purity. Somebody from the Brahmin class would think nothing about taking a bath 3 times a day and changing their clothes 3 times a day in order to maintain their purity, their cleanliness. Now, most of us think of India as a dirty, filthy place. Contrast that with the Brahmins, who have this tremendous focus on purity, both physical purity and spiritual purity. And they will not allow somebody that is unclean or impure or from another caste to touch them. Now, to tell you the truth, this is the power behind the story of the Good Samaritan. Do you remember that story in the Bible? The story there, of course, the priest comes by. Why will the priest not help the man who is beaten up and bloody? Because to touch him will cost him his purity. He will have to go through a fresh ritual of purification. He will have to take days and days out of his schedule to go through ritual purification. He did not want to lose his purification standard, and he did not want to have to lose weeks of his life regaining that status. So he had every reason in the world, from a human organizational standpoint, to walk on by. Let somebody who doesn't have as much to lose take care of this dude. So he goes on by. So prestige is reinforced by the laws of purity. When it comes to the people who disobey these laws, well, death or violence. And in caste-based societies, and not just caste-based societies, you have to throw a number of other factors in here, but you can find what we now know today as honor killings. And in honor killings, if you violate caste regulations, or if you violate purity laws, or if you violate the standards of our particular group of people, you shame our culture, you shame our family, therefore you're deserving of death. So, let's say you are a female here at Biola, and you decide to date somebody who is different than you. It could be racially different. It could be culturally different. Just somebody that's not part of your particular social ethnic group. And you go home and you tell your parents, I'm dating this boy at Biola. He's a wonderful Christian guy, and he's a second-generation Filipino, all right? In certain families, that's a death sentence. Your father will kill you in order to preserve the honor of the family. And so honor killings are widespread in these kinds of cultures. And it is looked upon without disdain in those cultures. And perhaps you saw the Time magazine that came out last year of the young girl, I think she was about 15, who lipped off her husband in Afghanistan, and he turned her over to local village authorities, and they cut off her nose, they cut off her ears, and they mutilated her because she had shamed her husband. Right now, there is a big trial going on in Kingston, Ontario, Canada, where a man there decided that his wife and 3 daughters had shamed him, so he killed them and put them in the back seat of his car and drove it into a lake or a river or a canal or something, and walked away and hoped that the evidence was gone. Well, they found it, and he's being tried now for honor killing. Honor killings are being prosecuted much more vigorously, and so in many of these families, the father will give their daughter an option. You have shamed me. I have only one choice. I must kill you to retain the honor of our family. If I kill you, I will go to jail, and your mother will suffer, your siblings will suffer. If you want to maintain the honor of this family and its well-being, you will go out and commit suicide. And pressure is put on the girls to commit suicide in order to maintain the honor of their family. Now, this is an ongoing crisis. It's an ongoing phenomenon. It is part of caste societies. Well, when it comes to class societies, we don't have these same kind of problems. Class society is much more typical of countries that have become industrialized. And as the Western world started going through the Industrial Revolution back in the 1800s, a number of interesting things happened. Mobility became possible. Folk could start making money under the impetus of capitalism with the breakdown of the power of the manufacturing guilds. People could earn money, they could get wealthy, and if they came to America, they could become landowners. They could go out, they could buy a chunk of land, they could farm it, they could become wealthy. Mobility was possible so that they could move from poverty on up into middle class and perhaps even all the way up to wealthy. All you have to do is come up with a great invention. You could become Steve Jobs, be a technological nerd, be very creative, develop all kinds of technological inventions, and become one of the richest men on earth. Up until, of course, his death, in which case the playing field got leveled again. But we have every chance of becoming wealthy. Now, there was a businessman who went up to Alaska during the gold rush, the Yukon gold rush, and he looked at all of these gold miners heading up to the gold fields. Now, if you know anything about the Yukon find, they would have to climb up this huge pass, and when they got to the top of the pass, the Canadian Mounted Police were there, and they had to ensure that they had so many hundreds and thousands of pounds of supplies so that they wouldn't starve to death in the wilderness. So they had to make many trips up the pass to bring all the supplies up. It was an incredible amount of work. Probably no more than 20 families became wealthy from the gold. The rest of the people who got wealthy there, I mean really wealthy, a lot of folk made a little bit, the rest of the folk who got wealthy off the gold mines were people who made money off of the miners. And this businessman looked at all that was going on here and said, I do not want to be trekking up to the top of this pass, the White Pass. I do not want to spend all my time digging there for probably losing money. I'm going to stay down here and take care of the needs of the miners down here. So he opened up a little saloon and boarding house and ran a saloon and made a fair degree of money serving drinks and other amenities upstairs with the young ladies that worked for his establishment. And then after he had made his money on the gold fields, he returned to New York where he invested in real estate. And his grandson today is doing fairly well on the East Coast. His name is Donald Trump. Now, his grandpa was just a plain old ordinary guy who had a shrewd head for business. He made money. He invested it well. He passed it on to his son. His son passed it on to Donald Trump. And now Donald Trump's got more money than all of us in this room. Mobility is possible, all right, in class-based societies. Now, that doesn't mean that it's an egalitarian society. Class society is not an egalitarian society. There is a difference between the wealthy or the well-to-do and the other folk, the poor folk. And that gap is growing in our present time, which is why we have the Occupy LA, Wall Street, et cetera, et cetera. We can move up. I think my family is an example of moving up. My father lived in a small village in the early 1900s. He was a mechanic. He was a truck driver. He was part of the upper, lower class, if I wanted to put a title on it. He moved to Toronto during World War II, worked as a mechanic, managed to work himself up to lower middle class. He was able to buy a house. He moved from lower middle class. We finally immigrated to the United States back in the 1950s. We were able to buy a house way out in the boondocks in North Redondo. You can't even buy that property for under $1 million anymore, but he got it for $300 down, $150 a month in payments. I mean, it was ridiculous. But we were now middle class. My mother worked, he worked, we were a two-income family. All of a sudden now we're rich enough for me to go to college, at my own expense, of course. We moved up into middle class. Now here I am. I'm at Biola, professor, full professor, big bucks. I am now among the top 10% of the wealth. Well, no, I didn't quite make it that high, because you got to have $1 million or more to make it that high. I'm still middle class, but the mobility, see, from upper lower class to lower middle class to middle class, with my wife's salary and my salary, we're probably upper middle class at this point. I really haven't stopped to check out those stats. We've moved. Now, if I was, if I'd become a lawyer or a business executive, maybe I'd be a, top 10%, but we're doing okay. Mobility is possible. With good hard work in America, you can do well if you make wise choices. So mobility is there. In a class-based society, rewards are unequally distributed. If you've got money, you can make money. If you've got prestige, you can build on that to get better opportunities. If you can get a letter of recommendation from somebody that's important, if you can get a personal reference from somebody that's important, you will have a better chance of moving into that position, or of getting that job, or of getting that loan, whatever. Rewards will be unequally distributed depending on where you are in the social class. Quite frankly, life chances will be favored for upper class people. Now, I'm going to throw some cold water on your dreams. If you want to become the next ambassador to France, you have come to the wrong school. If you want to become an ambassador, if you want a high-paying job with the government, you shouldn't have come to Biola. You should have gone to Yale or Harvard or one of the other Ivy League schools, because there they have the connections, they have the prestige, they have the ability to integrate into positions of authority. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't. A lot of Biola students have gone from here, they've taken the Washington semester, they have gone to work as interns in Washington, D.C. based organizations. They have done well. Why, we even have a Biola alumnus who is a major senator in a major Midwest state. And his name is even being pushed around as a possible presidential candidate in the future. One guy. Say, you can make it, but we are not the high prestige school that allows people who have money, who are in the upper class, to put their children into prestigious schools where they will then have a chance to get into prestigious occupations. If it's prestige you're looking for, go ahead and play that game. So, wealth. Wealth is concentrated upwards, all right? We've already seen that. That's part of the whole controversy that's raging right now. Should we tax the wealthy? Should we make them help the poorer people more? Is it fair for them to have all of this money? Should Justin Bieber pay $55,000 a year more in income tax in order to help you folk go to college? Well, that's your choice this next election. And prestige is often mixed. Sometimes you will get prestige, sometimes you won't. You really are playing with two cultures here. But did you see that movie Titanic? And in that movie, you have the folk of high-ranking status who are on the upper decks. And then you have all of the poor immigrants down there on the bottom. And they're down there playing their accordions and doing their folk dancing, and they're having a wonderful time. But they're really, life's pretty limited down there. Then you have all the folk up above, all dressed up, going to balls, etc. There is one woman there who is incredibly wealthy, but she is not part of the British aristocracy. And if you remember the story, she befriends this poor immigrant boy. Now, do you remember what her name is? Come on. Nobody remembers her name? You love that movie, and you can't remember her name. Let me ask you this, how'd she make her money? How'd she make her money? You people, What's her name?
I'm trying to think of it. I can't think of it. It's Rose, yeah.
American woman, right?
The American woman. No, it's not Rose. Rose is the American woman, not Rose. The older woman.
Kathy Bates.
You're trying.
Molly Brown.
There we go, Molly Brown. Where did she make her money? She made her money in the gold fields through her husband. Her husband made money in the gold fields. And she was called the unsinkable Molly Brown because she managed to survive the whole thing. Now, Molly Brown made her money, but did the wealthy aristocracy like Molly Brown? They could barely put up with her because she loved to snub her nose at high society. That's why she made friends with this poor immigrant. That's why she gives him a tuxedo, lets him get into the ball. She's snubbing her nose at the aristocracy. She's got the money, they've got to put up with her, but they're not going to grant her the same social prestige as the rest of aristocracy. So prestige is very mixed. Okay, so you have old money, you have education, you have accomplishment. These will all come together. I actually did a study of old money people, millionaires in Santa Barbara versus new money geeks. Guys who are making their money in the electronic explosion. And it's interesting to see the differences in their buying patterns when it comes to vehicles, whether they buy Mercedes-Benz or whether they buy something else. It's like what? Like? Oh yes, Great Gatsby is a good example. Yeah, that's a really good example of old money. Well, when it comes to power, power is generally accrues to those at the top. Money talks. People can buy influence with their money. As a matter of fact, that's one of the other complaints of the Occupy LA, Occupy Wall Street. Well, how do you handle dissidents in class-based societies? You can marginalize the people. You don't invite them to your parties. You can do everything you can to minimize their ability to have influence. You could do it socially. You can do it economically. You can deny them power and status. So, in America, we have a very interesting phenomenon. You have people from minority groups like African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Native Americans. These have long been stigmatized in American culture. In some respects, racism in America is basically a class struggle. It is an attempt by whites to control the power of blacks from the same advantages that they have because they want to keep that power for themselves. Now, I'm going to say something very, very controversial here, and you're free to disagree. Talk it out with your history teachers, but the Civil War was not really a war over states' rights. This is one of the great fictions that came out of the Civil War, where it was a struggle for states' rights. The South really did not care for states' rights. As a matter of fact, one of the things that the South did not want was for the northern states to have states' rights that would allow them to free slaves who fled to their states. The Civil War was really a war over white supremacy, the desire to maintain class power over minorities. And so rules were passed. As a matter of fact, the very first slaves to arrive in the United States, way back before it was the United States, the first slaves to arrive in the New World was in 1600. A Dutch slaving ship showed up off of New Amsterdam, which is now New York. People quickly bought up the slaves because they were desperate for more workers, so they bought up the slaves. America at that time did not have a system for dealing with slavery. What we had was indentured servants. The slaves were bought. They worked until they paid off the price of their purchase, and then they were set free because there was no system of slavery. The very first slaves in America became freedmen after they paid off their indentured services, and they started their own farms. The Dutch and later the English quickly caught on that this might not be such a good idea if they wanted to hold on to power, so they began passing slave laws that did not allow them, allow them to become free, and slavery became then an institution until the Civil War. During segregation, and we did have a period of segregation, it was illegal for people from one race to intermingle with people from another race. During segregation, it became more than a class war, it became a caste war. They had the same rules and regulations concerning caste that you find in India. Whites could not marry blacks under segregation. If they did, the black person was inevitably killed. Sometimes both the white and the black were killed. You had lynchings galore. This system persisted right up until the 1960s. In the 1950s, when I graduated from high school, it was illegal in the state of California for me to marry a woman of Chinese ancestry. Wouldn't you know it? Let's turn that sucker off. It was illegal for whites to marry people of a different nationality in California right up until the 1960s. In the South, you couldn't even stay in the same room with somebody of a different nationality. Police would come and arrest you and perhaps do even more. You are one of the few, you are among the first generation of people who can legally and socially marry people outside of your own race. And with that possibility has come a tremendous surge in interracial, interethnic marriage in the United States. It still has its problems. There are still students who go home from school during vacations and tell their grandmas or grandpas, I'm dating somebody who's different than me, and been told, I'm cutting you off of my inheritance. We still fight against racism in America. I'd like to see it come to an end, but you know what? It's a class struggle. We are fighting to preserve the privileges that are ours, which unfortunately happen to be tied to issues of ethnic origins or culture. Well, we need to move on. We've got a number of new dynamics taking place in the world today. It's called economic interdependence through globalization. We're getting consumerism running rampant around the globe. And we're seeing secularism threaten religions. Secularism is one of the primary reasons why the rest hate the West. They do not like the influence of secularization. I don't know if you're aware of it, but a young woman in Egypt decided that she wanted to press for greater freedom for women in Egypt. So she posed in a very artistic but provocative manner for a photo in which she was undressed, and she allowed her nude body to be shown on the internet. This has thrown the entire Egyptian government into controversy. Both conservatives and liberals are worried to death that this is what Egypt is going to become without the power and authority of Islamic rule. And it is currently clouding the whole environment in Egypt right now as they are coming up to elections. They are scared to death of secularism with its loss of values. And of course, they are worried about the continuing economic disparity. Southern Mexico does not want NAFTA to come down there and influence their culture. Why? Because some people are going to become horrendously rich, and that's going to leave the poor people feeling even worse. It is economic disparity. It is a protest against capitalism that has caused them to stop free trade to flow into southern Mexico. Well, this brings us to a really interesting question. What are the sources of world poverty? Now, I'd love to spend a whole semester on this. Unfortunately, we don't have the opportunity to do that. I'm just going to run through real quickly some major theories. But if you are interested in the whole question of poverty in the world today, you may want to think about taking a class next semester called Poverty in the City. And we're going to be looking at the whole question of urban poverty. It's not going to be international poverty, but it will be urban poverty. Why are so many people in the cities experiencing the problem of urban poverty, and what can be done about it? But there are some major competing theories regarding why some nations are rich and some are not. It's a fascinating study. It falls into what we call either the Modernization Theory, the Dependency Theory, or the Marxist Theory. We want to quickly go over these three attempts to understand global poverty. All right? So put on your running shoes. Here we go. Under Modernization Theory, the question is, what is the cause of poverty? And their answer is, nations are poor because they don't try hard enough. They're unwilling to give up their old ways. They're just not creative. They're locked into their traditional ways, and the traditional ways are what is keeping them impoverished. These are cultures that reject science, technology. For instance, a number of years ago, Indonesia was going through a food crisis, and there was not enough rice to feed many people in Indonesia. So the United States AID decided to send boatloads of American rice to Indonesia, and they were going to introduce them to how to grow rice with new scientific, technological support. Hundreds, thousands of bags of that rice arrived in my part of Indonesia, and we sat down to eat it. I loved it. Oh, that was good rice. Why are you laughing? You have some of that rice? It was terrible if you were Indonesian. Indonesians don't like American rice. They'd say, oh, it fluffs up so big and then you eat it and it makes you feel like you've just eaten nothing. It leaves you hungry afterwards. We like good, solid Indonesian rice. Fills your stomach, see. They rejected this new way of growing rice because it tasted horrible. And you know what? The same thing happened in Mexico when we introduced new hybrid corn. They said, this corn is terrible. If you got false teeth, it's great stuff, but you know what? We got real teeth. We want real corn. And so they rejected the technological innovations of our new food substances. They also claim that it's fear of competition, fear of innovation. So it's all their own darn fault. They would rather live in the comfort of their traditions. They would rather stagnate and just maintain the status quo. And so they're poor because it is their choice. Now, if you embrace this modernization theory, well, how do you change people's minds? You have to promote reform. You even have to force change. We're going to go in and we're going to require them to change. We're going to take their land from them. We're going to turn it over to agribusiness. We'll plant coffee in here, and they'll have to harvest our coffee. And if they starve to death, well, that'll just teach them to work harder to make gardens in other parts. And as a matter of fact, it'll make them more dependent upon salaries to buy their food. See, you will force change upon them. Or we could say, well, you know what? We'll just provide more technology, more aid. We'll solve this problem for you. You know what? You need bigger industries here. We don't have enough electricity. That's okay. We'll build a huge dam and we'll provide enough electricity to run all kinds of factories around here. Hey, wait a minute, if you build a dam here, you'll flood this whole valley up valley and you're going to displace 50,000 people. So what? They can move further out into the jungle. It doesn't matter if we displace 50,000 people. We're going to get electricity that will give jobs, that will develop the whole nation. And so we will try to provide more technology, more aid for bigger projects. And of course, one of the best answers to all of this is to send advisors, teachers. Any of you ever heard of the Peace Corps? Peace Corps was a great idea. It came up with President Kennedy. They sent thousands of Americans overseas to be advisors and teachers, to help build bridges, start factories. It's a great idea. If poverty could be solved by technological innovation, by more knowledge. And so this was their solution. Well, we didn't get very far in breaking the cycle of poverty, by the way. There are still many people who embrace that theory. We'll see how far they get. Let's go on to the dependency theory. Now, the dependency theory, well, let's put it this way. First of all, the modernization theory is embraced by the Western world, by those that are already wealthy and advanced, by the United States, by England, by Europe. People in the developing world have rejected that theory. What do you mean it's our fault? That's ridiculous. It's not our fault. You're blaming the victim. You really want to know what the causes of the world poverty are? It's because you have forced poverty on us. And so they call it what they call the dependency theory. They've said things like, colonialism destroyed our traditional cultures. You came in, we had a good thing going for us. We knew how to live in our part of the world. We were doing fairly well, and you destroyed all of our value systems. You destroyed everything that was good about our culture. You took away everything that was traditional. You destroyed our way of life. It's your fault. Furthermore, when you came, you took the best land, you took the best workers, you took the best resources, and you sent them all back to your countries to make yourselves wealthy. You impoverished us. You took our gold, you took our silver, you took our oil, whatever it is that you wanted, you took back to your country and you impoverished us, left us with nothing but the stuff that you did not want. There are a number of people who have challenged this theory, by the way, but nevertheless, it is a very powerful argument because massive amounts of wealth did flow from the third world into the colonial powers. That was the whole point of the colonial empire, was to extract the wealth of the undeveloped world on behalf of the more powerful war nations. So we took their wealth, we took their resources, we exploited their labor, we made them work as virtually slaves, and according to this theory, created grinding poverty. We did not allow them to have anything except the lowest level of survival and existence. And they say, while colonialism ended with World War II, by the way, that's just 2 generations ago, when colonialism ended in World War II was the last gasp of the colonial powers as they fought over the world. Who's going to have the world? We practically killed ourselves trying to maintain our colonial empires. We finally gave the nations their freedoms, or at least they took it on themselves, as in Indonesia when they had their war of freedom from the Dutch. They finally drove the Dutch out. They created the new nation of Indonesia. But these same developing countries now claim that today the Western world is trying to dominate the developing world through economic colonialism. Not through political colonialism, but political or economic colonialism instead. We're trying to control their growth and development by controlling the flow of wealth into and out of the nation. So, as such, they have said, see, coffee. You developed a coffee culture in our country. We have thousands upon thousands of acres of coffee. We grow coffee for Americans. We ship that coffee up to you. You enjoy your coffee, but you control the price of coffee. And if you would just allow coffee to rise 2 cents a pound, we could increase the wealth of our country exponentially. But you Americans will not pay 2 cents a pound more for your coffee. So you are the ones that are holding us in grinding poverty. Now, have you noticed that there is a difference in the price of a cup of coffee between Common Grounds and Eagle's Nest? Have you noticed that? Why is coffee more expensive in the Eagle's Nest? Is there nobody here with a social conscience? Is there nobody here who cares about world poverty? I can't believe this. No, you're just shy. That's what it is. You don't want me to embarrass you. Because Common Grounds serves regular coffee. Eagle's Nest serves coffee that is from a producer that seeks to give higher value to coffee growers in Latin America. So they pay more for their coffee. So when you buy from the common grounds, you are giving a greater share of your money to the coffee growers so that they don't have to live in grinding poverty. Oh, there's so much to learn about all of this. But fair share corporations have spread all over the place. Well, what is the answer of developing countries? Well, if you are the ones that are creating economic oppression over us, the best way for us to develop is to create national development. We will develop our countries ourselves. We will set up our own businesses. We will prevent foreign companies from working in our country. Can you buy a Chevrolet in Indonesia? Where does it have to be made? If it's made in America, you pay 200% tax. So a $20,000 car now is going to have $40,000 more thrown onto it, $60,000. But you could buy an Indonesian version of American cars, or more likely, Japanese cars, for $15,000. They have established their own car companies. They have established their own businesses. They have established their own steel companies. And when a major country in Latin America, Ecuador, no, not Ecuador. Well, let's not worry about it. One of the major Latin American countries decided to nationalize. They closed down all of the mines and nationalized them. All of the wealth from the mines will now stay in this country. Foreign companies will not rip us off. At least one Biola student had to withdraw from Biola because her dad had invested in a mining company with major dealings overseas. Lost every penny of his investment. It's all right. They were determined to keep their wealth local. The other answer is to establish socialist economies. This is one of the reasons why most of the developing world has a socialist orientation in their government. Local wealth to stay here in this country. In India, you cannot buy a Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola has been banned from working in India because they would not share their secret formula and they would not allow control to be maintained in America. So you can buy Coca-Cola-like products in India, you cannot get Coca-Cola there. We're going to establish a system of economic development that is nationalistically oriented. It is one of the reasons, by the way, why American businesses have trouble in Japan, because Japan wants to develop Japanese-based industries. Well, then comes the Marxist theory. The Marxist theory is going to take a different approach. They're going to say that world poverty is caused by a class war between the rich and the poor, because workers have been alienated or denied the right to produce their own goods. And if you take this solution, what is the answer to poverty? Well, revolution. Rise up, workers of the world. What have you got to lose but your chains? And so a Marxist approach to culture change is violence, revolution, and the formation of a government that will be responsible to the people, to the workers. And the goal of Marxism was to develop the economic potential for the workers. This was a very popular idea. It continues to be popular, even though communism has failed in Russia. Marxism still has a great deal of intellectual influence. So what do we want to say? What can we say as Christians? We've got three competing ideas. Let me suggest a very quick overview. I'm convinced that the real causes of world poverty are the ongoing causes or ongoing instances of warfare. You have countries that are torn up with international and national conflicts. Literally, hundreds of people die every day in local fighting. Over 24 countries in the world today are being racked by internal civil wars and conflicts. And this is what is destroying the economic well-being of many of these nations. The second form is corruption. When Indonesia got its freedom, they had to reorganize who would run the major departments of government. Do you know who got those jobs? All of the family members of the president and the military. Did they know how to run the forest industry? Not even a little bit. So what did they do? They made as much money as they could and they put it in their personal accounts. And corruption became rampant. It is not at all a big secret that years ago the president had a wife who was called Mrs. 10%. Yeah, Ibu 10%, because every economic deal that was cut, she got a 10% portion for her personal use. And downright mismanagement. These are the reasons that the world remains so much in poverty. But ultimately it comes down to greed and sin. As a consequence, what do we as Christians want to say about poverty? I think we have every right to champion people's access to their resources. We have every right to promote generosity to the truly needy. I think we have every right to help the poorest of the poor, to do everything we can to break the cycle of poverty. I think this comes about through responsible stewardship. So quite frankly, I'm happy to pay a few cents more for my coffee if I know that that's going to improve the life of folk in South America who are growing that coffee for me. And we need to support righteousness and justice.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.